Hello everyone, hope you all are doing well. Welcome to Diplomat's Desk. I am your host Meet Shah. What happens when the world's biggest economy boycott or refuses to show up at the world's biggest economic table? In this November 2025, leaders from across the globe gathered in Johannesburg for a historic first, the G20 Summit on African soil under the South Africa's presidency and the theme solidarity, equality, and sustainability. But one chair was empty. The United States boycotted the summit, citing disputed claims about discrimination against white Afrikaners in South Africa, allegations widely rejected as misleading or outright false. Yet, despite the boycott, the G20 adopted a leaders' declaration, pushed ahead on climate finance, debt relief, and inequality, and even called for UN Security Council reform and a strong condemnation of terrorism, priorities India strongly supported. So, did America's absence weaken the G20 or just highlight a world that's learning to move on without it? Let's break it down. What was special about this G20? First, the basics. The 2025 G20 Johannesburg Summit took place on 22nd and 23rd November 2025 at the Johannesburg Expo Center chaired by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. It was the 20th G20 Summit and the first ever in Africa. South Africa's presidency framed four big priorities for the year: disaster resilience and response, debt sustainability for the low income countries, climate finance and just energy transitions, critical minerals for inclusive and sustainable growth. In simple terms, help poorer countries survive climate disasters, escape debt traps, and benefit from the green transition instead of staying stuck at the bottom of the value chain. So, the official G20 leaders declaration reflects this. It emphasizes support for developing economies, climate adoptions, and fairer global finance under the overarching theme of solidarity, equality, and sustainability. So, the stage was set for an Africa centered G20, and then the US decided not to come. Now let's talk about the US boycott, what really happened. In the weeks before the summit, President Donald Trump announced that no senior US official would attend, accusing South Africa of persecuting its white Afrikaner minority and even citing debunked notions of white genocide. South Africa rejected these claims as a false and racist, insisting there is no state policy of racial discrimination and describing the US position as an attack on its domestic politics. So the key points were: the US boycotted the talks entirely, a first of Washington since G20 leaders summit began. South Africa signaled it would hand the G20 presidency to an empty chair, a very pointed diplomatic gesture, before reluctantly acknowledging the formal transition to the US for 2026. Other leaders, including from China, Russia, and Mexico, also stayed away at head of state level, sending premiers or foreign minister instead. In the US media, commentators called the boycott a major diplomatic misstep, arguing it hands influence to others, especially powers like India and the European Union, just as Africa's importance is rising due to its young population and critical minerals. So the question many in Johannesburg were quietly asking was, is this still a G20 or a G19 with an empty chair? So what did the summit actually agree on? Despite this old drama, South Africa pushed through a declarations which most members signed on day one over US objections at a distance. Here are the core agenda areas and outcomes simplified. First, climate and just energy transition. Commitments to scale up climate finance for developing countries, support for just energy transitions, helping coal and fossil dependent economies shift without destroying jobs. Second, debt and global financial reform. Push to make debt restructuring faster and more predictable, building on the common framework but with more say for the debtor countries. Discussion of new tools and blended finance to help African and low income countries invest in green infrastructures. Third, inequality and development. Emphasize on inclusive growth, jobs, and social protection, especially in Global South. A stronger role for the African Union, now a permanent G20 member, in shaping development priorities. Fourth, terrorism and global governance. A strong statement condemning terrorism in all its forms, something India pushed hard for. Renewed calls to reform the UN Security Council to make it more representative, implicitly backing claims from countries like India, Brazil, and African states. Fifth, critical minerals and supply chains. Recognition that Africa's critical minerals from cobalt to rare earth must fuel local industrialization, no, not just raw exports, with talk of responsibly supply chain standards. Argentina withheld full endorsement on some language, especially around Middle East issues, but the overall declaration still went through, and South Africa declared it a diplomatic victory. So, India's point of view is in this summit was about three big things: continuity, credibility, and security. Continuity from its own 2023 presidency. India had championed the Global South, digital public infrastructures, and climate finance during the Delhi G20. In Johannesburg, Prime Minister Narendra Modi positioned India as the bridge between Africa and the developed world, reinforcing that agenda instead of starting from scratch. Winning on counter-terrorism language, the leader's declaration includes a clear condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, aligning closely with long-standing Indian demands. Indian media immediately highlighted this as a diplomatic win, especially in the context of cross-border terrorism concerns. Backing United Nations Security Council's reform and Global South voice, India used this summit to reiterate if the G20 recognizes Africa's centrality and calls for UNSC reform, then India, the world's most populous country, deserves a greater role by supporting African priorities and UNSC reform language. India strengthened its case for permanent UNSC seat in a future reformed council. Strategic opportunity from the US absence. With Washington outside this room, India's presence as a major democracy from the global south became even more visible. Commentators noted that while the US weakened its own influence, India and the EU filled part of that diplomatic vacuum. In short, from an Indian POV, this G20 was a chance to show responsible leadership, support Africa, and argue for a more balanced world order, all while the US chose to sit out. Now let's see the impact on different countries and blocs. Let's talk about South Africa and Africa first. Symbolic win as the first African G20 host. Concrete progress on climate finance, debt, and critical minerals as development tools. Soft power boosts. Johannesburg showcased as an economic hub, and Africa is now central to G20 debates, not just as a guest. Second, United States short term sends a strong ideological signal to its domestic base. Long term risks being seen as unreliable on multilateralism, especially when it's supposed to chair the G20 in 2026 at Trump National Doral in Florida. Several leaders and commentators suggested that if the US won't engage, others will simply move ahead without it. Next is European Union and the G7 allies position themselves as defenders of the rules-based order, making the declaration and the climate debt language. Opportunity to deepen ties with Africa while Washington steps back. China and Russia. Top leaders did not attend but sent senior representatives. They quietly support global south narratives on debt and climate but are also major creators, so they face pressure to compromise on the debt relief. Other global south countries like Brazil, Indonesia, etc. continuing the global south troika story. Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa as a consecutive host. These make it harder to dismiss G20 as just a rich country club. Hidden but important detail, a lot of ambitious inequality proposals like formal wealth inequality panel did not make it into the final text, showing that even in global south G20 big structural reforms still face resistance. So final diplomatic take and call to action is here is, so what does this G20 in South Africa really tells us? Africa is no longer just a venue, it's becoming a central actor in global economic governance. The India voice on terrorism, UNSC reform, global south priority is getting harder to ignore, and that boycotts by big powers create space others are more than willing to fill. From a diplomatic perspective, the most important sentence of this summit might be this unspoken one, which is multilateralism will continue with you or without you. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and share it with someone who follows geopolitics and tell me in the comments, does the US boycott makes the G20 weaker or more independent? See you in the next one. Thank you for watching.